She said she loved the work. What she loved was what the work was worth. I want to tell you about the night I found the shareholder register. It was a Tuesday in late October. Lena was at her parents' house in Djursholm for the week her father had been unwell. Or so she told me, and she was staying out there to help her mother manage the situation. I had been in the workshop until 9, finishing the joints on a dining table commission that was due the following Friday. And when I came upstairs to our apartment, I was tired, in the specific way of a person who has been doing physical work for 11 hours, and whose hands still carry the memory of the plane and the chisel. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I don't know why I opened the laptop. I wasn't planning to work. The administrative side of the business was something I dealt with in the mornings. Not late on Tuesdays after long workshop days. But the laptop was on the table and I opened it. And in the browser history, I found that someone had been on the Bolagsverket website, the Swedish company's registration office, and had searched the company name Lindqvist Möbel Design AB. I don't look at the Bolagsverket records often. There's no reason to they change only when filings are made. And I know when I've filed things because I file them myself, or I instruct my accountant to do it. I looked now because someone had been looking on my laptop. And I wanted to know what they had seen. What I saw was a shareholder register that was not the one I had filed 8 months ago. The company had been founded 3 years earlier with a share capital of 50,000 kroner. All held by me, the register I had filed, and updated when Jonas came in. Listed me at 80%, and my friend Jonas Anderson at 20%. That was the structure I knew. That was what I had built. The register on the screen showed something different. My stake was 42%, a holding company called Bergström Invest. A B held 38%. Jonas was unchanged at 20%. Bergström, Lena's family name was Bergström. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea going cold, and I thought about the last 8 months about the evening Lena had asked me to look over documents that her father's lawyer had prepared. Documents, she said, were related to a financing arrangement her father wanted to make through the company. A way of formalizing the support he had been offering informally. I had been in the middle of a complicated commission at the time. A sideboard with hand-cut dovetails that required the kind of sustained concentration that doesn't leave much room for document review. And I had trusted her. I had trusted her the way you trust the person you have been with for 3 years, whose parents you have dinner with every few weeks, whose father has been, since you met him. Warm and interested and supportive of what you're building. I had signed the documents. I had not read them carefully enough. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Outside. Stockholm was doing what Stockholm does on a late October night quiet. Dark. The water of Ridderfjärden, visible in the distance where the city lights reached it. I had lived in this apartment for 4 years. I had built the workshop below it. I had spent 3 years making the company that those 2 rooms contained the apartment where I slept and ate and worked at the kitchen table, and the workshop where I made the things the company was built on. I picked up my phone. I thought about calling Lena. I put it down. I thought about calling Jonas. I put it down again. I thought about what calling anyone, right now, before I understood the full scope of what I was looking at, would do to the situation. And then I called my lawyer. Her name was Anna Söderström, and she had been handling the company's legal affairs since I incorporated it. She answered on the 4th ring, which meant I had woken her. and I said, "Anna, I'm sorry to call this late. I need to tell you something, and I need to know if I understood it correctly." She said, "Tell me." I told her about the shareholder register. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me a screenshot right now, and don't contact anyone involved until we've spoken tomorrow morning." I sent the screenshot. We said goodnight. I sat in the kitchen until after midnight, thinking about 3 years and what 3 years actually contain, and what it means when the thing you thought you were building alongside someone turns out to have been something else entirely. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. To understand the story properly, you need to understand what the company was and how I built it. Because the company was the thing at stake, and its nature determined the nature of the betrayal. I grew up in Gothenburg, the son of a carpenter who built residential staircases and banisters for building contractors across the city. My father was not a designer. He was a craftsman, in the specific and unglamorous sense of a person who makes the same thing, to the same standard, in the same way, for 30 years. Because the thing needs to be made, and because making it well is its own form of dignity. He taught me woodworking the way he knew it as a trade, as a set of skills and habits that were to be learned through practice rather than through theory, and that were measured by whether the finished piece was correct, and whether the joint held, and whether the surface was smooth enough to run your hand across without catching. I learned everything he knew by the time I was 16, not because I was precocious, but because the lessons were daily and practical, and the only way to learn them was to do them. And I was in the workshop whenever I wasn't in school. By 16, I could cut a clean mortise and tenon by hand. I could fit a dovetail without gaps. I could tune a plane so that the shaving it produced was thin enough to be almost translucent. These were not remarkable skills in the context of what a competent carpenter knew. They were the foundation of everything I would build on later. What I didn't have at 16, and what I spent the decade after developing, was design sense. My father could make anything you specified, to whatever dimension you required, and it would be correct in every technical respect. He could not tell you what to make, or why the proportions should be one way rather than another, or what made one piece feel right in a room and another feel wrong. This wasn't a failing, it was simply outside his domain. But I wanted both. I wanted the craft and the design, the hand and the eye, and getting both required me to leave Gothenburg. I went to Konstfack, the University of Arts, crafts and design in Stockholm when I was 20. The program was furniture design, and the first year was the most intellectually disorienting experience of my life, in the specific way that encountering a new way of thinking about something you already know how to do is disorienting. I knew how to make furniture. I had no vocabulary for why furniture should be made one way rather than another. No framework for the relationship between form and function, and material, and the life that furniture inhabits and enables. Konstfack gave me that vocabulary and that framework over 4 years. And by the time I graduated, I had what I had been looking for, both the craft and the design. After graduation, I spent 2 years working for a mid-sized Swedish furniture manufacturer called Hård & Köpö, which made contract furniture for hotels and offices. The work was educational in the way that industrial production always is when you come from a handcraft background. The scale, the tolerances, the relationship between the design intention and what the manufacturing process could actually deliver. But it was not. In the end, what I wanted to do was make individual pieces, by hand, to a standard that industrial production could not reach. For people who understood what that standard meant, and who valued the specific quality that handwork produces, I left Hord och Co. and started Lindqvist Möbeldesign AB in my third-floor workshop in Södermalm, with a second-hand bandsaw and a set of hand tools that I had been accumulating since I was 16, and a very specific idea of what I was trying to make and for whom. The idea was this furniture that looked simple, and was, on close examination, the product of considerable skill and sustained thinking. Not the simple that is actually plain, the simple of furniture that has nothing going on, the simple that is the result of removing everything that shouldn't be there, the simple of a joint that is perfectly fitted, a surface that is perfectly flat, a proportion that is exactly what it needs to be and nothing else. The kind of simple that requires years of practice to achieve, and that, once achieved, sits in a room and asks for nothing and gives everything. I had seen this standard in old Scandinavian furniture and in certain Japanese pieces, and in the best work of a handful of contemporary makers, whose names I knew from the design press, and whose workshops I had visited when I could. I had not seen it widely in the contemporary Swedish furniture market, which was, for the most part, either the mass-produced end of the design tradition, well-designed, well-priced, technically competent, or the high-end end, which was beautifully finished, but often more interested in formal drama than in the quiet rightness I was after. The first 3 years were hard, in the way that building any small business is hard. I was making pieces and selling them through a small network of contacts, a gallery in Östermalm that showed craft and design, a few interior designers who specified my work for clients, the occasional private commission that came through word of mouth. The income was irregular, and the periods between commissions required careful management of the company's cash position. I lived in the apartment above the workshop, which kept the overhead low. I worked long days and most weekends. I learned, slowly and sometimes expensively, the administrative and commercial side of running a business that my design education had not covered. By the 3rd year, the company had found its footing. The reputation was building in the specific, slow way of craft reputations, one piece at a time, one satisfied client at a time. The network of interior designers who knew my work, expanding gradually through referrals. The commissions were getting larger and the clients more interesting. I had a waiting list for the first time. I had taken on Jonas's investment, which had allowed me to buy better equipment and to fund the longer lead times of more complex commissions. The business was, for the first time, generating enough income to be genuinely viable rather than merely survivable. It was at this point, at the moment of genuine emergence, when what I had been building for 3 years became visible as something real, that Henrik Bergstrom's assessment of it shifted from general appreciation to specific interest. Asterisk. I should tell you about Henrik properly, because Henrik is the engine of this story, and you cannot understand the mechanism of what happened without understanding the man who designed it. Henrik Bergstrom was 61 when I met him, the father of the woman I was with, a successful commercial property developer, who had spent 30 years buying and developing industrial and office space across Sweden. He was not a dramatic figure. He didn't have the showy quality of certain wealthy businessmen. The luxury cars and the prominent philanthropy and the public profile. He drove a sensible Volvo. He sat on the board of a small regional hospital. He wore clothes that were well-made and boring. He gave the impression, in social contexts, of a person who was genuinely interested in other people and who remembered what they told him. This last quality was the one that mattered most, and the one that I registered too late as significant. Henrik remembered everything. He remembered names and details and timelines with the specific precision of a person who has spent 30 years in a world where knowing things about other people, their financial position, their vulnerabilities, their plans is professionally valuable. He asked questions, and he retained the answers, and he built. Across months of dinners and occasional conversations, a detailed picture of the thing I was building and what it was worth. The commercial property business teaches a specific and immoral form of intelligence about value. You understand that every asset has a moment of transition, a point at which its current use is less valuable than another possible use, and that the person who identifies that moment and acts on it makes money. Henrik had been doing this for 30 years with buildings. The skills were transferable. What he saw, across those months of dinners, was a furniture company at exactly the moment of transition. The moment when 3 years of genuine quality had produced a reputation that was beginning to generate significantly more revenue than the year before. When the market was beginning to understand what Lindqvist Mobile Design AB was and to value it accordingly. When the company's equity was at the inflection point between its founding value and its emerging market value. He also saw, and this was the specific intelligence of his assessment, that the company's managing director was focused on the work, not on the administration, that the corporate governance was handled by an accountant and a part-time lawyer and not by Eric Lindqvist himself, and that the mechanisms of Swedish company law offered, to a person with the right legal advisors and the right access, a set of tools that could be used to acquire a significant stake in a closely held company, without the owner fully understanding what he had agreed to. He had Lena. Lena was the access. I want to be careful here about what I say about Lena and what I say about how much she understood of what her father was doing, because I spent a long time during those months thinking about it, and I arrived at a view that I still hold, which is that the truth of her role was more complicated than either full complicity or complete ignorance. Lena was intelligent. I said this before, and I mean it precisely. She had the specific intelligence of a person who has grown up around money and who has learned, from that proximity, to read financial situations with an accuracy that most people who haven't grown up that way don't develop. She understood the company's position. She had watched it develop across 3 years of being embedded in my life. She knew what the waiting list meant, and what the increasing commission sizes meant, and what the reputation the company was building would eventually translate to in financial terms. She also loved her father with the specific love of the eldest child, who has grown up in the image of the parent who most resembles her, the parent who is precise and sharp, and who makes decisions quickly, and who sees the world in terms of what it offers, and what you do with what it offers. Henrik and Lena were alike in ways that I had found charming when I first observed them, and that I understood differently later. My honest assessment of what happened is this: Henrik identified the opportunity, designed the mechanism, and brought Lena into it in a way that allowed her to tell herself she was helping her family without fully confronting what she was doing to me. The document she brought to me on the Sunday evening was presented to her by her father's lawyer as a standard formalization of an informal arrangement, and she had either not read it carefully enough to understand the conversion clause, or had read it and had told herself it was a technicality. I do not know which. I know that she brought it to me and described it in a way that was misleading, and that the misleading description produced the signed document, and that the signed document produced the shareholder transfer. Whether the misleading description was deliberate or was itself the product of her being misled by her father, this is the question I sat with for months and that I never fully resolved. I stopped trying to resolve it eventually because the resolution was not available to me, and because the actions themselves were what mattered for the case, not the intentions behind them. Anna Soderstrom was at my apartment at 8 the next morning. Wednesday, with her own printout of the Bolagsverket register and the specific focused quality of a lawyer who has spent 20 years dealing with small business disputes and who has learned to read a situation quickly and without drama. She sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee, and she went through the screenshots in the register and said almost nothing until she was done. When she was done, she said, "Tell me about the documents you signed." I told her everything I could remember 8 months ago. A Sunday evening, Lena had brought them to me after dinner. She had described them as the formalization of Henrik's informal support, the introductions to his network, the loan of the storage facility, the 80,000 kroner he had lent me during a cash flow gap. She said her father wanted to put the relationship on a more formal footing, that the documents were a shareholder agreement reflecting his contributions. I had read the first 2 sections, seen the standard shareholder agreement language, and signed at the places she indicated, Anna said. "Do you have copies?" I said I don't think so. Lena said she would file them. Anna said nothing for a moment, which was itself a response. She said the transfer of 38% of a company's share capital requires the managing director's signature on a transfer instrument and the filing of an updated register with Bolagsverket. The transfer has been filed. Your signature is on it. The question is what the document you signed actually said. She requested a certified copy from Bolagsverket that morning. It arrived at her office at 3 in the afternoon. She called me at 4. She said the document you signed was a shareholder agreement, as Lena described, but embedded within it, in Section 7 of an 11-section agreement, written in standard contractual language that would not be immediately alarming to a person reading quickly, was a clause providing for the conversion of Henrik's informal loans and in-kind support into equity at a specified conversion rate, exercisable at Henrik's election. I said, "What does that mean in plain language?" She said you gave him the right to convert his previous support into a 38% equity stake whenever he chose to exercise it. He exercised it 6 months after you signed. The transfer is legally valid because your signature is on the document that granted the right. I sat with this. She said, "I need to be honest with you. The validity of this depends on whether you understood what you were signing. The clause was in the document you signed. It was not hidden in a separate instrument, but it was embedded in language that was not straightforward. And the way Lena described the document to you was materially misleading about what it contained. I said, can we challenge it? She said, potentially. There are grounds for a challenge based on the misrepresentation of what the document contained on the gap between what Lena told you it was and what it actually was. Whether that's sufficient to void the transfer depends on what we can establish about her knowledge. If we can show she knew about the conversion clause when she presented the document as a simple formalization, the misrepresentation case is strong. If she genuinely didn't understand it herself, if her father's lawyer presented it to her in the same misleading terms, the case is weaker. I said she knew. Anna said, what makes you confident? I told her. The specific quality of Lena's financial intelligence. The 3 years of watching her read the company's position with accuracy. The specific carefulness of her manner on the Sunday evening that I could now reconstruct as the carefulness of someone managing a performance. Anna listened. She said, I believe you, but I need you to understand that what you believe and what we can prove in a legal proceeding are different things, and that a misrepresentation claim against a party who is the daughter of one of the most well-connected property developers in Stockholm requires a specific and complete evidentiary foundation. I said, what do we need? She said, documentation of Henrik's communications with his lawyers in the period leading up to the document signing, which will take time and subpoena power to obtain. Documentation of Lena's involvement in the preparation of the documents, which may exist in email correspondence, and witnesses to what Lena told you on the Sunday evening. I said there were no witnesses. We were alone, Anna said. Then we build the case from the documentary side, which takes time. I said, how long? She said, months, 3 at minimum, possibly longer. I said, what do I do in the meantime? She said, you go to work, and you act normally. You don't confront Lena. You don't contact Henrik. You don't post about it or discuss it with anyone except me and Jonas. You let me build what we need while you build the company. Because the company is what we're protecting, and the company needs to keep running. I said, all right. She said, and Eric, one more thing. I said, yes. She said I need to look at the full shareholder agreement carefully. The conversion clause was one thing. I want to make sure I understand what else might be in that document before we decide on strategy. I said, what are you looking for? She said, I'm looking for the second step. The conversion clause gave him 38%. 38% is significant, but it's not control, if he's as sophisticated as your description suggests. The conversion clause was not the end of the plan. I said, what's the end of the plan? She said, I'll tell you when I've found it. She found it in the 3rd week. What Anna found was that Henrik had, 2 months after the equity transfer was filed, approached the company's bank about a new credit facility. The approach had been made in the name of Bergström Invest AB as a minority shareholder. The bank had declined, noting that the proposed facility would require majority shareholder approval that a 38% stake could not provide. He had been trying to access the company's credit before I understood what was happening. The bank had stopped him. But the attempt itself was the evidence of the second step's direction he needed a majority. And the majority was available if Jonas's 20% could be acquired. Anna told me this on the phone, and then said, I think the next move is Jonas. I had thought so too, from the moment I had understood the arithmetic. 38% plus 20% was 58%. A majority. A majority shareholder could do what a minority shareholder could not. I called Jonas that evening. Jonas Anderson, my oldest friend, We had met at upper secondary school in Gothenburg, had both eventually come to Stockholm, had maintained the friendship across the years when adult life tends to pull people apart. He had invested in the company not as a commercial calculation, but as an act of faith in me, in the work, in the thing I was trying to build. His 20% stake was an act of friendship that happened to have a financial structure. I said, Jonas, I need to talk to you about something serious before you do anything involving your stake in the company. I need to tell you what I know. He said, tell me. I told him everything. The shareholder register, the conversion clause, the bank approach, the second step. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him. Jonas had always been a listener, the person in the room who said little and understood most. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, when did you find out? I said, 3 weeks ago. He said, and you didn't call me for 3 weeks. I said I needed to understand it completely first. I needed to know what we had before I brought anyone else into it. He said, have they approached you about selling? He said it the way you say something you already know the answer to. I said, has someone contacted you? He said, Matilda X office called last week. She's Henrik Bergstrom's lawyer. I said, what did you tell them? He said, I said I'd think about it. I didn't know then what I know now. I said, Jonas, I need your 20% to stay where it is, and I need something else. He said, tell me. I told him about Anna's strategy, the misrepresentation challenge, the preemption right mechanism, the buyback that would require a bridge loan I couldn't fund from the company's current cash position. He said, how much? I told him. He was quiet again. He said, I can do that. I said, it's not. I don't want you to feel obligated because we're friends. He said, Eric, you built this company. I'm not going to sit on my 20% while your girlfriend's father takes it from you because of a clause in a document you signed without reading it carefully. Tell me how it works. I told him how it works. He said he would call his own lawyer in the morning. We said goodnight. I sat in the apartment afterwards and thought about friendship in the specific way you think about it when it has just been demonstrated in a concrete and substantial way. Jonas had said yes in 30 seconds. He had not asked for security, had not asked to review the documentation Anna had assembled, had not qualified his commitment in any of the ways that a person making a financial commitment usually qualifies it. He had said yes because I had asked him to, and because 20 years of knowing me had given him the information he needed to answer. I want to name this as clearly as I can, because the account of a betrayal is also the account of what was not betrayal. And what Jonas did in that phone call was its opposite. It was the specific and unqualified loyalty of a person who acts from his understanding of who you are, rather than from his calculation of what acting costs him. I went to bed thinking about the dining table commission, which needed to be finished by Friday, and about the proportions of the stretcher that I had been uncertain about since Tuesday. The stretcher was right as it was. I had known it was right, and had been second-guessing it, because the pressure of the weeks had made me uncertain about things I would normally be certain about. The stretcher was right. I could finish it tomorrow. I slept. The week Lena came back from Djursholm was the 6th week since I had found the register, and it was the hardest week of the whole period. She texted during the week she was away. Her father was improving. She would be back Saturday. I replied in the tone of a person who has no particular news. This was the performance, the ordinary partner, the ordinary life I had become. Over 6 weeks, reasonably competent at it. But the Saturday was different, because by the Saturday, the EGM had been called, and the papers had been served on Bergstrom Invest AB and on Lena in her capacity as the person who had presented the documents to me. And she knew that I knew. She said nothing when she came through the door. She put her bag down in the hall. She looked at me across the kitchen with an expression I want to describe accurately. She looked like someone who has been expecting a thing for weeks, and who has arrived at the moment of it with a kind of exhausted relief. She said, "When did you know?" I said, 6 weeks ago. She said, "The browser history." I said, "Yes." She looked at the window. The late October Stockholm morning was gray and still. She looked at it for a while. She said, "I want to explain." I said, "You can. But I want to tell you something first." She looked at me. I said, "I don't need you to have been entirely cynical about 3 years for this to be what it is. I've thought about it for 6 weeks, and I don't think you were entirely cynical. I think there was probably a version of the story you told yourself in which what you were doing was something other than what it was. I think your father is very good at creating those versions and presenting them to the people who need to believe them in order to do what he needs them to do." She said nothing, I said. "But I also think that on the Sunday evening, when you sat across this table and described those documents to me, you knew enough about what was in them to understand that the description you were giving me was not the complete one. I think you knew I would not have signed them if I had understood the conversion clause. And I think you made a decision." She said he told me it was a formality. He said you wouldn't mind, that you would understand it was just about making things official. I said, "Did you believe that?" A long silence. Outside the window, a tram moved along the street below, and the sound of it was the ambient sound of the city going about its morning. She said, "I thought you might mind a little. I thought there would be a conversation. I didn't think it would be this." I said, "What did you think this would be?" She said, "I thought we would be partners. I thought if the company grew, we would all grow together. My family and us." I looked at her. I said, "Your family and me, growing together while your father owned 38% of my company without my consent." She said nothing. I said, "What did you think was going to happen to my 80%? She looked at her hands. I said, "Lena, the reason it's this is because of what you did and what your father did. That this is not something I created. I found a shareholder register and I found out what it meant and I responded to it. Everything else that happened followed from what you and your father did, not from me." She said, "I know." I said, "I think you should go back to Djursholm until the EGM is over. I don't think it's good for either of us for you to be here right now." She left that afternoon. She packed a bag without saying much, and I sat in the workshop not working, just sitting at the bench, and I listened to the sounds of the apartment above me as she moved through it collecting her things. And then I listened to the front door, and then to the silence. I sat at the bench for a while. The dining table was there, joints fitted, waiting for final planing. I picked up the plane. I worked until midnight. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The extraordinary general meeting of Linkfist Mobile Design, AB, took place on a Thursday morning in November, in a conference room at Anna's law firm on Biblioteksgatan. It was a cold, clear Stockholm morning, the kind where the light comes off the water with a specific brightness that the city only has in the late autumn when the leaves are gone, and there is nothing between the light and the stone. Henrik Bergstrom arrived with his lawyer Matilda Ek, a well-regarded commercial litigator in her late 40s, who had the composed and slightly expressionless quality of a professional who has been in many rooms like this one, and who does not waste energy on anything that is not directly useful to the argument she is making. Jonas arrived with his own attorney, a younger man who said little. I arrived with Anna, who had spent 3 weeks preparing for the morning with the specific, focused preparation of someone who has identified the precise set of questions the other side will ask, and who has an answer for each of them that is both accurate and strategically positioned. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Henrik entered it, I think, with a degree of confidence that reflected his assessment of the legal position. The conversion clause was in the document I had signed. The transfer had been properly filed. The company law mechanisms had been correctly followed. His 38% stake was, in his view, legally valid and would survive the challenge. What he had not anticipated was the procedural deficiency. Anna had identified a specific requirement in the Swedish Company Act relating to the notification process for equity transfers, which had not been fully complied with in the execution of the filing. The deficiency was not catastrophic on its own, but combined with the misrepresentation claim, it created a picture of a transaction that had been improperly executed from the outset. He also had not anticipated Jonas. He had assumed, and I understood this from the way he looked at Jonas when the meeting opened. With a brief recalibration of something in his expression, that Jonas's 20% was available. He had not known that Jonas knew, or that Jonas had committed his response before Matilda Ek's office had the opportunity to make its formal approach. The legal argument occupied most of the 3 hours. I will not reproduce it in yon detail, because it belongs to lawyers and to the specific language of company law that is accurate and important in its domain and tedious outside it. What I will tell you is the moment, in the second hour, when Matilda Ek paused in the middle of a response to a point Anna had made and turned briefly to consult Henrik in low-voiced Swedish. The consultation lasted, perhaps, 45 seconds. When it was over, Matilda's manner had changed slightly, not visibly to anyone who hadn't been watching for it. But I had been watching, and the change was there. The confidence of the position had become the management of the position. Henrik looked across the table at me once. During the afternoon, he looked at me the way a person looks at something they have assessed and whose assessment has required revision. Not angry. Henrik was not. I thought, a person who experienced much in the way of anger, more the expression of a person registering that a situation has not developed as they expected, and who is already thinking about what comes next. I did not look away. The meeting adjourned without resolution. As Anna had predicted, these things do not resolve in a single meeting. And what the meeting had accomplished was the establishment, in the formal record, of the challenge and its grounds, and the legal basis for the preemption right. That was what Thursday was for. The process would run for months, but the foundation was laid. Jonas and I walked out together onto Biblioteksgatan. The cold air was sharp after 3 hours in the conference room. He said better than I expected. I said we haven't won yet. He said no. But the game has changed. He got in a cab. I walked back to the workshop. There was a set of chairs to make 18 ladder-back chairs in ash for a restaurant in Vasastan. Due in 8 weeks, I had 6 weeks of legal proceedings ahead of me, and I had 18 chairs to make, and both of these facts were simply true simultaneously. And managing both simultaneously was what the situation required. I went back to work. The proceedings that followed took 4 months. I want to tell you about them honestly, because the honest account includes what they felt like from the inside as well as what they produced. And the inside is harder to describe, but closer to the truth of the experience. They were the quietest 4 months of my professional life. Quiet in the sense that I had done what could be done for the moment, and the rest was process Anna and Matilda Eck, exchanging positions through letters and briefs, and the formal machinery of a contested shareholder dispute, moving at the pace that such machinery moves, which is deliberately and sometimes frustratingly slowly. I made furniture. I made the 18 chairs for the Vasistan restaurant. Then I made a writing desk in elm, which was technically the most ambitious piece I had undertaken, with a drawer construction that I had been working out in sketches for months, and that required a level of precision in the fitting that pushed me to the edge of what I could consistently achieve. The desk took 8 weeks. I was grateful for those 8 weeks. The concentration the work demanded was complete enough to make the waiting manageable. Lena and I did not speak during those months. The personal relationship had ended on the Saturday she left the apartment. There was no dramatic final scene. There had been the kitchen conversation. And then she had left. And then the process had taken over as the form of the relationship between us, mediated through lawyers. I received a text from her in December, brief, saying she hoped I was well. I read it twice and did not reply. I want to be honest about this period and about what it contained, because the honest account of a betrayal includes what was lost alongside what was taken. Lena and I had been together for 3 years. The 3 years had been genuine. The relationship had been real in the ways that a 3-year relationship is real, the habits of shared life, the specific comfort of another person's presence, the evenings talking about the work over dinner, the knowledge of being understood. None of this became false because of what happened. It became irretrievable, which is different. I carried this alongside the legal proceedings, and alongside the 18 chairs, and alongside the writing desk. And the carrying was daily and specific, and required its own form of management. I am not going to describe it as easy or as something that the clarity of what had been done made straightforward. It was its own weight, separate from the legal weight, and both had to be carried at the same time. The specific form of the sadness that I felt during those months was not primarily the sadness of having been wronged. It was the sadness of having lost the 3 years in their entirety, not because the 3 years were false, but because the knowledge of what had been done made it impossible to hold them the way they needed to be held to remain usable as a past that you carry forward rather than a past that sits in the background and weighs on the present. I couldn't think about the first dinner, or the night at Blos och Knoda when we had talked for 2 hours, or the evenings at Djursholm, without the knowledge of the Sunday evenings sitting at the back of all of it, and changing what the things before it meant. This is the specific damage that betrayal does to the past. It doesn't erase it. It recontextualizes it. And the recontextualization is a form of loss that is different from, and in some ways harder than, the legal and commercial loss that is more visible and more easily addressed. I made the furniture. I waited for Anna to call. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Anna called on a Wednesday in early March. The call came at 10 in the morning while I was in the workshop, and I remember exactly where I was standing at the bench on the north wall, checking the squareness of the elm desk's case before I began fitting the drawer. She said, "I have the settlement terms. They came in last night. Read them and call me." I read them on my phone, standing at the bench. The terms were the equity transfer to be treated as voidable on misrepresentation grounds. Henrik Bergström to return the 38% stake in exchange for a payment at the original conversion value. The shareholder structure to revert to 80%. Lindqvist. 20% Andersson. Bergström invest. AB to make no further approaches to the company or its shareholders without my consent. The bank approach to be formally withdrawn. The settlement to be confidential. In exchange, I would not pursue the misrepresentation claim through the courts. I stood at the bench for a moment. The elm desk was behind me. The morning light was coming through the north windows. Outside. Stockholm was in the specific state of early March, when the light has just started to change, but the cold is still real. When the city is beginning its emergence from winter, but hasn't arrived there yet. I called Anna. I said, "Is this everything we could have gotten?" She said it's everything available without extended litigation. Litigation might have produced a larger financial recovery, but would have taken another 12 to 18 months. Cost more than the additional recovery would have justified, and put the company through a sustained period of uncertainty that wasn't in its interests. On the primary objective, recovering the equity, this is a complete outcome. I said the primary objective is the one that matters. She said, "Then accept the terms." I said, "Accept them." We said goodbye. I put the phone down on the bench. I stood in the workshop for a while, looking at the elm desk, thinking about the 4 months since November and the 6 months since the registration night, and about what the whole arc of it contained and what it had produced. It had produced the accurate shareholder register. It had produced Jonas's 20% staying where it was. It had produced Lindqvist Mobile Design AB with its 80% intact, its credit facility undisturbed, its commission pipeline uninterrupted. It had produced the dining table, delivered on time in October. The 18 chairs, delivered in January to a restaurant owner who sent me a photograph of the chairs around the tables on the opening night, lit by the restaurant light, full of people. The elm desk, which was being collected the following week by a client in Lidingö who had been patient and who deserved the best version of the piece I could make. The company was what it had always been. The work was what it had always been. The shareholder register now said so. I picked up the plane. I went back to work. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The months after the settlement have the specific quality of the period, after an extended pressure has been removed. A lightness that is partly relief, and partly the gradual return of attention to things that the pressure had been consuming. I noticed the work differently. I noticed the quality of the light in the workshop at different times of day, in a way that the preceding months had not left me the attention to notice. I noticed how good it felt to finish a piece and know it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Jonas came to the workshop in April, for the first time since before the proceedings had begun. We spent an afternoon there, which we had not done in months, him watching me work on a new commission, a side table in birch, while we talked about the company and about what came next, and about the things that old friends talk about when they have been through something difficult together and have reached the other side of it. He said, "Do you regret any of it? Meeting her, the relationship, the whole thing?" I thought about the question carefully before answering. I said, "I regret the Sunday evening. I don't regret the 3 years." He said, "That's the right answer." I said, "It's the true one. I'm not sure those are always the same thing." He said, "Sometimes they are." He picked up a scrap of the birch I'd been working with and turned it in his hand. looking at the grain. Jonas was not a person who worked with materials. He was an economist. He thought in numbers and systems, but he had spent enough time around my workshop to have developed a genuine appreciation for what wood looked like and how it behaved, which was one of the things I valued about his presence there. He said, "What made you think this was worth fighting for?" I said the company was worth it. "Everything I've built for the past 3 years is in it." He said, "Is that the whole reason?" I thought about it. I said I grew up watching my father make things correctly. He never cut corners. He made the joint the right way, even when a faster way would have passed inspection. He believed that the quality of the work was not negotiable, and that everything else, the money, the reputation, the professional standing, was the result of that quality being non-negotiable. He looked at me. I said I couldn't let someone take the result and leave the foundation. The foundation is the thing. If I let that happen, I would have spent 3 years building something on a foundation that wasn't actually mine. And I would know it. I would know it every time I was in the workshop. Jonas put the birch scrap down. He said, "Your father taught you well." I said he did. We didn't say much after that. I went back to the side table. He sat and watched me work until the light changed, and it was time for dinner. ****. Lena I saw once, about 3 months after the settlement. We passed each other on Södermalm, near Mariatorget, on a spring afternoon when the light was the specific gold of Stockholm in May, warm and long and forgiving of the winter that had preceded it. She was with a friend. I was walking back from a hardware supplier on Hornsgaten with a bag of brass fittings for a cabinet commission. She saw me, and for a moment we were both stopped on the pavement, and I thought about what to do with the moment. I nodded. She nodded. We continued. This is the form that some endings take. Not a conversation. Not a reckoning. Not any of the things that might seem necessary or cathartic from outside. Two people who have reached the end of something, passing each other on a street in Stockholm on a spring afternoon, and both of them knowing that the passing is the end. I walked back to the workshop through the Södermalm streets with the bag of brass fittings. The spring afternoon was warm. The city was doing what it does in May, opening up. People outside. The specific quality of release that a Scandinavian city has when winter finally fully ends. I passed the building where I had first had an apartment when I came to Stockholm. 12 years ago. I passed the cafe where I had read for years on Sunday mornings. The city had the layered quality that familiar places have the present moment sitting on top of all the previous moments in the same space. I thought about the grain of the elm desk. It had been collected by the leading client and installed in a study. And she had sent me photographs of it in the room, the way it sat in the space, the way the elm's figure caught the light from the window. It was a good piece. It was exactly what I'd been trying to make. I thought about the next commission, which was a tall cabinet in oak with leaded glass panels, the most complex piece I had taken on, requiring skills in glass work that I was going to need to develop specifically for the project. I was looking forward to developing them. The development of a new skill in the service of a specific piece was one of the specific pleasures of the work. The way each commission pushed into territory the previous one hadn't required. I thought about the workshop and the apartment above it, and the way the company had continued. Through all of it, through the registration night, and the 6 weeks of performing normalcy, and the EGM, and the 4 months of proceedings, and the settlement. the way it had simply continued. Because the work required it to continue, and because the work was the foundation, and the foundation had not been touched. Henrik Bergstrom had tried to acquire 38% of what I built. He had succeeded in doing so. For 8 months, through a mechanism that had depended on my trust and my inattention and the specific vulnerability of a person who is focused on the making rather than the administration. He had then lost it, because the mechanism had been improperly executed, and the misrepresentation was provable, and Anna Soderstrom was better at her job than Matilda Eck had anticipated. The company was mine. It had never stopped being mine in the sense that mattered most, the sense of the work, the capability, the knowledge of how to do the thing the company existed to do. That was always in me, and it was never in his 38%, and it couldn't have been acquired through any document. I reached the workshop. I let myself in. I put the brass fittings on the bench. I looked at the cabinet commission's drawings, spread on the workbench where I had left them that morning. The proportions were right. The construction sequence was clear. The glass work was going to be difficult and interesting. I made tea. I sat at the bench and looked at the drawings. In the morning I would begin. The work was still here. It had always been here. It will always be here, for as long as I can do it. Because the work is in me and the making of it is what I am. And those things do not appear in any shareholder register and cannot be filed away in any holding company, and are not available for conversion at any equity rate. The grain of the wood tells you what it wants to do. You work with the grain. Everything else, in the end, is just paperwork. I want to go back and tell you more about the 3 years before the October night, because those years are the ones that made the October night matter, and because the account I gave you of them moves too quickly past the things that were in them. My father's workshop was in the garden of our house in a suburb of Gothenburg called Mölndal, a separate structure that he had built himself the year before I was born, from materials he had accumulated over 2 winters, from the demolition jobs he sometimes took when contracting work was slow. It was a long, low building with a pitched roof and windows along the north wall. He had read somewhere that north light was the best workshop light, even and shadowless, and he had believed it and had built accordingly. The floor was concrete, poured in sections over 2 weekends with help from his brother. The walls were wood-framed and insulated with the care of a man who understood that a cold workshop was a dangerous workshop, that cold hands make poor judgments. I spent more time in that workshop than anywhere else in my childhood, not because my father pushed me toward it. He was not the kind of parent who pushed, who had a plan for what his children should become. He simply worked, and the work was there. And I was interested in what he was doing, and he was willing to explain it. The explaining was the education. He explained while he worked, which meant the explanation was always connected to the specific problem in front of him, the joint he was fitting, the surface he was finishing, the piece he was evaluating for straightness or squareness. The explanation was never abstract. The first thing he taught me was how to hold a plane, not the grip itself that came quickly, but the body position, the way you move through the stroke, the relationship between your weight and the tool's cutting edge that determines whether you're peeling the surface accurately or skidding across it in a way that produces ripples. He spent a full afternoon on this. On a length of pine, he had set up in the vise for the purpose, and he did not proceed to the next thing until I could take a shaving off the full length of the board that was consistent and thin and produced the surface you wanted when you ran your hand along it. This is the specific way he taught. One thing, fully. Before the next, no shortcuts, no approximations, no good enough that was actually less than good. He was not harsh about it. He was patient. He repeated the demonstration without impatience. He was generous with his time in a way that I understood later was not common. That many fathers who work with their hands in this way are not willing to share the work with their children because sharing it slows it down. He slowed it down willingly. The teaching was the point. By the time I was in secondary school, I had the craft, not fully formed, not the version of it that years of practice would eventually produce. But the foundation. I understood wood, its nature, its movement, the way it responds to moisture and temperature, the way the grain runs and what that means for how you work with it. I understood tools. I understood joints and what made one appropriate for one situation and another appropriate for another. What I did not have, and what the secondary school years made me feel the lack of, was design. I was making things that were technically correct and aesthetically uninteresting. I was making the same things my father made, because those were the things I knew how to make, and the things my father made were serving a function: staircases, banisters, framing rather than expressing a form. The question of what a piece of furniture should look like, and why, and how the form and the function related to each other, was not a question my father's workshop had taught me to ask. I asked it anyway, alone, in the way of a 17-year-old who doesn't have the vocabulary for a question, but who knows the question is there. I borrowed design books from the school library. I found a copy of a collected works of Carl Malmsten, the Swedish furniture designer, whose work I would later understand as one of the central references of what I was trying to do in a second-hand shop near the school, and I studied it in the evenings with the attention of someone trying to extract a principle rather than an image. I understood, from Malmsten, that the relationship between form and function was not a technical problem, but a design problem, that you could not derive the right form from the function, that the form required a separate act of creative judgment that was not the same as the craft judgment of how to make the thing once you knew what it was. Konstfack taught me the rest. 4 years in Stockholm, in a program that took the technical side of furniture making for granted and focused on the design side, the form, the material choices, the relationship between the piece and its context, the questions of what furniture was and what it was for, and what it meant in the lives of the people who lived with it. It was the specific education I had needed, and it arrived at the specific moment when I had the craft foundation that allowed me to take full advantage of it. By the time I graduated, I had both. The craft from Mölndal, from my father's workshop, from 20 years of making things with my hands, the design from Konstfack, from 4 years of thinking about why things should be made the way they should be made. The combination was not common. Most furniture designers had the design training without the deep craft knowledge. Most furniture makers had the craft without the design vocabulary. I had the unusual luck of having both. From the unusual combination of my background and my education. Lindqvist Mobile Design, a B was built on that combination. The company existed specifically because of it. Because there was a particular kind of furniture that the combination made possible, that neither the designer without craft nor the craftsperson without design could make. And that there was a market for in Stockholm, in the specific way of markets for things that are genuinely better than the alternative. The 3 years of building the company before I met Lena were the years of establishing that this was true. That the market existed, that the clients were there, that the quality I could produce was distinctive enough to attract them and consistent enough to retain them. The first year was the year of survival, taking whatever commissions came, learning the client management side of a small creative practice, developing the habit of consistent quality under conditions of irregular income and frequent uncertainty. I made bookshelves for a young couple in Östermalm who had been referred to me by a gallery contact. I made a kitchen table for a retired architect in Vasastan who had specific opinions about proportions and who turned out to be the kind of client who teaches you as much as you teach them. I made a cabinet for a hotel in Gamla Stan that was the most technically demanding piece I had attempted in that. When it was finished and installed, generated 3 referrals from guests who asked the hotel where it came from. The second year was the year of definition, finding the specific vocabulary of the work, understanding what made a Lindqvist Mobile Design piece distinctive in a way that the word of mouth could carry. The vocabulary emerged from practice rather than from planning. I noticed, across the year, that the pieces that satisfied me most fully were the ones where the formal simplicity was the result of eliminating everything that wasn't necessary, where the joint was visible because it was the right expression of the connection rather than because hand-cut joints were fashionable, where the proportion of every element had been arrived at through a process of subtracting rather than adding. This was the version of simple that I had been after since the Malmsten book in secondary school. The third year was the year it became real, in a commercial sense, the waiting list, the increasing commission sizes, Jonas's investment, the beginning of the reputation that would eventually attract Henrik Bergström's attention. The Östermalm couple referred 3 friends. The retired architect wrote a piece for a small design publication that described the table with the specific precision of someone who understood it fully. The hotel gave me a second commission. This is the company that Henrik's lawyers registered in Bergström Invest AB's name. This is what the conversion clause in the Sunday evening document was designed to give him access to. 3 years of daily work, accumulated into a reputation and a client base, and a specific quality of output that the market had learned to recognize and value. He had been watching it develop across those 3 years of dinners at Djursholm, with the specific attention of a person who makes his living identifying assets at their moment of transition. He had been patient. He had waited until the right moment, and then he had used Lena to give him the document he needed. ****. I want to tell you more about Lena, because I gave you an account of her that was accurate, but incomplete. And the complete account matters for understanding the full truth of what happened. Lena Bergström was 31 when we met at the Blås och Knöda gallery opening, 2 years before the Sunday evening. She was the daughter of Henrik and Marianne Bergström, the eldest of 2 daughters, educated at a private school in Stockholm, then at Stockholm School of Economics, then at a design school in London for a year. She had been working at an interior design studio in Östermalm for 4 years. The studio did high-end residential interiors for private clients. The kind of work that requires both taste and the specific social fluency of a person who can manage wealthy clients and their specific versions of good taste. She had both. The taste was genuine. I said this before, and I mean it as a precise observation rather than a generous one. She understood furniture, textiles, materials, the relationship between a room's light and its surfaces, the way that proportion and scale determine whether a space feels right or feels wrong. She had developed this understanding through her upbringing, in houses that her parents had filled with good things, and through her design education, and through 4 years of working with clients who cared about the specific quality of their environment. She also had the social fluency, the ability to read a room, to understand what a person wanted, and to give it to them in a form that felt like their own idea. This was the skill of someone who had grown up in Henrik Bergstrom's household, where the management of how things appeared was a constant background activity, where the gap between what was true and what was presented was navigated with a practiced ease that the people in those rooms rarely noticed. I had noticed it, in the way that you notice something without identifying it as notable as a quality of Lena's social manner that I found attractive because it looked like charm. The ease with which she moved through social situations, the way she made people feel understood and valued, the specific attention she gave to everyone she spoke to that made each person feel that they were the most interesting person in the room. This was real, in the sense that it was a genuine capacity and not a fully calculated performance. But it was also, I came to understand, a skill that had been developed in the service of Henrik's specific way of being in the world, a world where other people's comfort and trust were resources to be managed. The 3 years of the relationship had been the best 3 years of my personal life. And I want to say this clearly because the saying of it is part of the honest account. Not because the relationship was uncomplicated. No 3-year relationship is uncomplicated, but because what Lena brought to it was specific and genuine. She engaged with the work. She understood it in a way that no previous partner had understood it, because she had the design knowledge to engage with it intellectually rather than simply appreciating it aesthetically. She asked questions that made me think differently about what I was doing. She came to the workshop and watched me work without the performative interest of someone who is trying to be supportive, and the actual engagement of someone who finds the process genuinely interesting. She had, I think, genuinely loved me during those years. Or she had loved the version of the relationship that existed before her father's interests became directly engaged with what I was building. These two things, genuine love and the accommodation of her father's interests, are not as mutually exclusive as the structure of a betrayal story might make them seem. People contain multiple orientations simultaneously, and the orientation that wins in a specific situation is not always the one that would win in a different specific situation. The Sunday evening was a specific situation, and the orientation that won was not the one I needed it to be. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The period between the conversation at the kitchen table and the EGM was 5 weeks. And I want to describe those 5 weeks more fully than I have, because they are the weeks that determined what the EGM would be, whether we arrived at it with a case that was solid, or with a case that was sufficient, but exposed. Anna worked during those 5 weeks with the methodical persistence that I had come to value in her across 3 years of working together. She requested the certified copy of the shareholder agreement, obtained it, and went through it with a fine-tooth comb that identified not only the conversion clause I had known about, but 2 additional clauses that had not been visible in my initial understanding of the document. One of these was a clause giving Henrik the right to appoint a board observer, not a full board member. An observer, which was legally distinct but practically significant. The other was a drag-along clause that would allow a majority shareholder to compel minority shareholders to participate in a sale of the company on the same terms, which was standard language but which, in combination with the conversion clause, painted a clearer picture of the end goal: acquire a majority, appoint observers to understand the company's full operation and value, and exercise the drag-along in a sale that would realize the value at a time and on terms of Henrik's choosing. This was the full plan. Not a takeover in the sense of wanting to run a furniture company. Henrik had no interest in running a furniture company. A financial extraction: acquire equity cheaply at the current valuation. Wait for the valuation to increase. Sell at the increased price and capture the difference. My work. His return. Anna, though, spent 2 weeks establishing the evidence base for the misrepresentation claim. This required identifying witnesses not to the Sunday evening itself, which had no witnesses, but to what Lena had said to others about the document and its contents in the period before and after she brought it to me. Anna found, too, a colleague of Lena's at the design studio, who had a WhatsApp exchange with Lena from the week before the Sunday evening, in which Lena had described the document as Papa's way of making his involvement official, with no mention of the conversion clause, and a friend of mine, peripherally, who had spoken to Lena at a dinner party 2 months after the signing, and who had heard her describe Henrik as having a stake in the company present tense, which was accurate only because the conversion had already been exercised, not because of any arrangement that existed at the time of the signing. These were not damning by themselves, together with the structural analysis of the clause, its complexity, its burial in the document. The disparity between the way it was characterized and what it actually provided, they built a picture of a document that had been presented in a way that was materially misleading. The third element was the procedural deficiency. Anna found it in the 4th week. Working through the specific requirements of the Swedish Company Act for the execution of equity transfers. The requirement that had not been fully complied with related to the notification that needed to be given to existing shareholders before a new equity transfer was filed. The notification had been given to Jonas, as the only other existing shareholder, but in a form that was deficient in a specific technical respect. The timeline and the content of the notification did not meet the Act's requirements. The deficiency was not enough, on its own, to void the transfer, but it was enough to require the court to examine the full circumstances of the transfer before confirming its validity, which was exactly the condition under which a misrepresentation claim had the most force. Anna presented all of this to me in the 4th week in a meeting at her office. She laid it out in the sequence in which it would need to be presented, at the EGM and in any subsequent court proceedings. And she walked me through each element and its evidentiary weight, and the counter-arguments that Henrik's lawyers would make, and how she intended to address them. When she was finished, I said, "Is there anything that worries you about this?" She said the misrepresentation claim is based on what Lena knew and when she knew it. And our evidence for that is circumstantial. The WhatsApp exchange and the dinner party conversation establish a pattern, but not a direct admission. If Lena maintains that she genuinely did not understand the conversion clause when she presented the document, the claim becomes harder to prove. I said, "Do you think she'll maintain that?" Anna said, "I don't know. She's Henrik's daughter, and she's had 3 years of watching how he operates. She may have understood the clause and simply not told you. She may have been told about it by Henrik's lawyers and chosen not to tell you. Or she may genuinely have been presented with it as a formality and accepted that framing without examining it. All 3 of these produce the same outcome for you. You signed a misleading document, but they have different implications for the legal claim." I said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I need you to write out, in as much detail as you can, everything you remember about the Sunday evening and everything you know about Lena's understanding of the company's financial situation over the course of the relationship. I need to understand the full picture of what she knew and didn't know as a foundation for the claim." I wrote the document that evening. It was 12 pages, handwritten first and then typed, covering 3 years of the relationship through the specific lens of what Lena had understood about the company at each stage. It was not a comfortable document to write. It required me to examine 3 years of shared life with an analytical attention that was at odds with the way you normally hold the memory of a relationship. But it was accurate. Every detail I could recover was in it. Anna read it and said, "This is useful. The specific conversations you recount about the commission pipeline, about the waiting list, about Jonas's investment, these establish her knowledge of the company's trajectory in a way that's hard to reconcile with a genuine misunderstanding of the conversion clause's significance." She added the document to the file. The EGM was 4 days away. After the settlement was signed. Anna sent me a final note that summarized the outcome and what it meant for the company's legal position going forward. The note was 2 pages, precise and complete. The specific document of a lawyer who values clarity. At the bottom of the 2nd page, below the formal conclusion, she had written a single line in a different register from the rest of the document. "I think your father would have found this outcome appropriate." I had not told Anna about my father. Not in any detail. But she had been my lawyer for 3 years and had learned some things about me from the work. And this was something she had learned. I sat with the note for a while. My father died 4 years ago. The year I came back to Stockholm after Konstfack. He died of a stroke in the house in Mölndal, in the workshop, which was where he spent most of his time after he retired from the contracting work, and which was where he would have wanted to die. My mother found him in the afternoon when he didn't come in for lunch. The paramedics said it had been quick. I flew back from a conference in Gothenburg, and I went to the house, and I sat in the workshop for an hour before I went into the house to be with my mother. I sat at his workbench, which was the bench I had stood at every afternoon of my childhood, with the specific smell of the workshop wood and oil and the particular scent of the hand tools around me. And I thought about what he had given me and what it meant, and how much of what I was going to build in my life was going to be built on the foundation of what he had given me. What he had given me was the craft, the specific, patient, non-negotiable standard of what correct meant and how to achieve it. The understanding that the work was the point, not the money, not the reputation, not the professional standing, but the work itself. The specific act of making a thing correctly, as well as it could be made, because that was what the thing deserved. I had built Lindqvist Mobile Design AB on this foundation. I had fought to keep it on this foundation, and when the settlement was signed, and the company was mine again, what I felt most clearly was that the foundation was intact, that everything Henrik had tried to do had touched the structure of the company without touching the foundation, and that the foundation was the thing that mattered. I called my mother that evening and told her the proceedings were over. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes. The company's fine." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I know. I'm all right. It's been a hard few months, but it's over and it ended correctly." She said, "Your father would have said the same thing. Ended correctly. That's how he talked." I said, "I know. I think I got that from him." She said, "You got more than that from him." We talked for a while longer, and then she went to bed. And I went to the workshop. And I made tea and I sat at the bench and I thought about what came next. What came next was the tall cabinet in oak with the leaded glass panels, which I had been looking forward to for weeks, and which was going to require the development of the glass work that I had never done before. What came next was the company, continuing. With the commission pipeline intact, and the reputation building, and the shareholder register showing 80%, Lindqvist exactly as it should. What came next was the work. The work was still here. It had always been here. The grain of the wood tells you what it wants to do. You work with the grain. You build from the foundation. You make the joint correctly, even when a faster way would pass inspection, because the quality of the work is not negotiable, and because everything else, the money, the reputation, the professional standing, is the result of that quality being non-negotiable. My father taught me this in a workshop in Mölndal when I was 6 years old. I have been working with it ever since. I want to go back and tell you more about the specific weeks of the proceedings. The 4 months between the EGM and the settlement, because I described them too briefly and because they deserve their full account. The weeks had a specific rhythm. Monday and Tuesday were workshop days, the deepest work of the week. Wednesday and Thursday were a combination of workshop and client contact, the meetings, the site visits, the correspondence that commission work generates. Friday was administration and the conversation with Anna, which happened every Friday afternoon by phone, in which she gave me a status update, and I told her what I needed her to know. The status updates had a consistent quality for the first 2 months the process was proceeding. Positions were being exchanged. The documentation was doing what documentation does in contested proceedings, which is accumulate until the weight of it makes the outcome visible to everyone. Anna's tone in these conversations was consistently composed. She was not a person who dramatized proceedings, or who used the lawyer's version of false optimism that suggests the outcome is clearer than it is. She said what she knew and what she didn't know, and the distinction was always clear. There was a Friday in December, the second Friday of December, when Stockholm was in the specific early winter state of permanent low light, the kind of light that arrives in late November and doesn't lift until the new year, when Anna said something that I want to tell you about, because it changed how I understood the situation. She said, "I want to ask you something that isn't strictly about the legal situation." I said, "Ask it." She said the settlement Matilda Eck proposed last week. I told you it was insufficient, and you agreed. But I want to make sure you're making the decision clearly. The proposal would have given you back 80% of the equity, but required you to pay a premium over the conversion value. It was insufficient because of the premium. The premium meant you were paying for what you already owned. But the alternative to settling is continuing the proceedings, which means more time, more cost, and more uncertainty. Are you certain you want to continue? I thought about it. I said, I'm certain. She said, what makes you certain? I said the premium was Henrik's acknowledgement that his position was weaker than he had expected. When you're asked to pay a premium for something that was wrongfully taken from you, the premium is the other side's way of extracting value from the act of returning it. I'm not paying a premium for the return of what was mine. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's the right analysis. I said, is it also strategically correct? She said, yes. Matilda Eck proposing a premium means she's looking for an exit, which means her client is less confident than he was in November. Holding firm for another 6 to 8 weeks will produce a better settlement. I said, then we held. The better settlement arrived in March. As she had predicted, the equity returned at the original conversion value. No premium. Full extinguishment of all claims. I want to tell you about the evenings during those 4 months, because the evenings were the hardest part, and because they're what I remember most distinctly, now that the whole thing is behind me. I live alone in the apartment above the workshop. I had lived there with Lena for 2.5 years, and the apartment had, across those 2.5 years, acquired the specific character of a shared space, the way two people's habits and preferences gradually accumulate in a living space until it feels inhabited rather than merely occupied. After Lena left in October, the apartment changed. Not dramatically. She had taken her things cleanly, without fuss, in the 2 days after the kitchen conversation. But the absence of her presence was present, in the specific way that absences in familiar spaces are present, as a series of small noticings of what was not there. I managed the evenings through work, not the commission work that was for the workshop, for the daylight hours, when the concentration required was full and undiluted. The evenings were for the administrative work, the correspondence, the reading and thinking about design that was the background radiation of the professional life. I had always done this, spent evenings in the apartment reading about furniture, looking at images of work I admired, thinking about the problems the current commissions were presenting. The evenings had been, when Lena was there, shared across the table, interrupted by conversation and dinner and the presence of another person. Without her, they returned to the solitary form they had been before. I found the solitary form, unexpectedly, easier in some ways and harder in others. Easier because the concentration was uninterrupted. Harder because the concentration had no one to emerge from. Working alone is different from sharing a life. It has a quality of efficiency that shared life doesn't have, and a quality of completeness that it lacks. The evenings were efficient. They were not complete. I thought about this during those months, about what I wanted the future to look like, and about what the proceedings and the end of the relationship and the whole experience had changed about that picture. I did not arrive at clear conclusions. The future felt like a domain that required more distance from the immediate situation before it could be thought about, with the accuracy it deserved. I left it at a distance and focused on the work. The work was what I had. The work was what I had always had. And it was. In the specific conditions of those months, the most reliable thing available. A piece of furniture does not change its requirements based on what is happening in the legal situation of its maker. The elm desk required the same precision on the days when the proceedings were going well and the days when they were uncertain. The 18 chairs required the same attention to the joint fitting on the Monday after a difficult Friday call with Anna as on the Monday after a productive one. The work was constant in a way that nothing else during those months was constant, and I held to it with the specific gratitude of a person who has found the reliable thing in an unreliable period. I want to tell you about the 18 chairs more specifically, because they were the commission that ran through the middle of the proceedings, and because the quality of their making was the most direct expression of what I have been trying to describe about the relationship between the work and the situation. The commission was for a restaurant called Bjork, a new place in Vasastan, run by a chef named Lotta Engvall, who had specific opinions about the relationship between a restaurant's physical environment and the quality of the experience it produced. She had found me through the retired architect in Vasastan, who had been the second-year commission, who had seen the cabinet she had had made for her entrance hall, and had sent Lotta my way. Lotta wanted 18 chairs, ladder-back chairs in Swedish ash, handmade, consistent enough to read as a set from across the room, and varied enough to feel individual on closer examination. This is a specific design challenge. The making of multiples in handcraft. It requires a different orientation than the making of a single piece, less of the intuitive, improvisatory quality of working out a form as you go. More of the systematic precision of establishing the form and then reproducing it with sufficient consistency to hold the set's identity. I had made multiples before, but never at this scale, and the discipline it required was different from what the singular commissions required. I made the first 2 chairs in the first 2 weeks of November, establishing the form and the dimensions and the specific sequence of construction that I would use for all 18. The first chair took 11 days longer than I had estimated, because the form required more refinement than I had anticipated before it was right. The second chair took 6 days, because the refinement was done and the sequence was clear. Then I made 16 more, one by one, over 8 weeks. Each chair took between 4 and 6 days depending on the specific characteristics of the ash I was working with. Ash is a wood with significant variation between pieces, and adapting the construction to the specific board while maintaining the set's consistency required the kind of daily assessment and adjustment that keeps the work from being mechanical. The chairs were delivered in January to Bjork, which opened in February. Lotta sent me a photograph of the opening night, the chairs around the tables, the restaurant full of people, the light in the room doing what the right furniture does in a well-designed space, which is be part of the room rather than furniture placed in a room. The chairs looked exactly right. I kept the photograph. Not to show people I'm not someone who shares work on social media or who collects documentation of commissions as a portfolio display. I kept it because looking at it produced a specific feeling that I wanted to be able to access the feeling of something made well, doing what it was made to do, in the right place. This is what the company made possible. This is what Henrik Bergström had seen and had decided he wanted a share of without doing the work that produced it. This is what the 4 months of proceedings had been, preserving the ability to continue producing. The photograph is on the wall of the workshop. It's been there since February. I want to say something about Jonas that I haven't said yet. Because Jonas's role in the story is the specific counterpoint to the betrayal that makes the story complete. Friendship between men who have known each other since they were teenagers is a specific thing. It is not the friendship of shared interest or shared professional world, or the friendship of people who have chosen each other based on current compatibility. It is the friendship of people who have known each other through the forming years, and who have, as a result, a knowledge of each other that was acquired in conditions of genuine openness, and that persists through the subsequent years, in which adult life produces the closing that happens to most people as they learn to manage their presentation. Jonas knew me before I knew how to manage my presentation. He knew me when I was 17, and unsure of everything except the workshop and the specific quality of concentration that the work produced in me. He had watched me find my way from that to this, to the Stockholm apartment, and the company, and the reputation, and the commissions. He had watched with the specific attention of an old friend who is genuinely interested in what the person he has known for 20 years is making of himself. When I called him and told him about the shareholder register, he had spent approximately 30 seconds deciding what to do. Not because the decision was easy. The money was real, and the risk was real, and anyone could see the obvious hesitation in the situation, but because the decision was already made by what he knew about me and what he valued about our friendship. And the 30 seconds was not deliberation, but the time it took to confirm that the decision was what he knew it was. He said yes. He kept his 20%. He bridged the buyback. He sat in the EGM conference room on a cold November Thursday and said nothing. Because his presence was the argument, and the argument needed no words. I want to say that this is the specific and irreplaceable contribution of a genuine old friend. Not the dramatic things, not the speeches or the declarations, but the specific showing up, when the showing up is the thing that is needed. Jonas showed up. That is the whole of it. And the whole of it is enormous. I told him this in the April workshop afternoon, when we spent a few hours together after the settlement. Not in a dramatic way. Not with the specific language of emotional declaration that the situation might seem to warrant. I said I want to tell you what it meant that you said yes immediately. He said you would have done the same. I said I hope so. He said I know so. We let that be enough. Which is what old friends do. They let enough be enough, without needing it to be more. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. There is one more thing I want to tell you. And then I'll let this story be what it is. In the summer after the settlement July, when Stockholm is the city at its most fully itself. The long days and the warmth and the water and the specific quality of a Scandinavian summer that the dark half of the year makes feel like a gift rather than a default. I visited my mother in Gothenburg for a week. I went to the house in Mölndal. My mother was well, and the house was as it had been. And on the first evening, I went out of my father's workshop after dinner and stood in it for a while. The workshop had not changed. My mother had kept it as it was tools on the walls, where he had left them. The plane on the bench where he had left it. The smell of the space still the same compound of oil and wood, and the specific climate of a controlled workshop. the north windows, the concrete floor, everything in its place. I stood at the workbench. I ran my hand along the surface of the workbench, which was smooth from decades of use, and I thought about what this bench had taught me and what the teaching had eventually produced. I thought about the dining table delivered in October, on time, while the legal situation was developing around me. I thought about the 18 chairs delivered in January to a restaurant in Vasastan. I thought about the elm desk in Lidingö. I thought about the tall oak cabinet with the glass panels that I was in the middle of making, the most ambitious commission of my career. I thought about the shareholder register, now showing 80% Lindqvist, exactly as it should. I thought about what it meant to build something from the foundation that a person who was no longer alive had given me, and about the specific responsibility of that, not the sentimental responsibility of honoring a legacy, but the practical responsibility of using what you were given in the way it was meant to be used. My father had given me the craft and the standard and the specific understanding that the quality of the work was the foundation and that everything else was built on it. I had built a company on that foundation, and I had fought to keep the company because the company was the mechanism through which I continued to do the work, and the work was what the foundation was for. The foundation was intact. The work was continuing. That was what he had given me the tools to do. And it was what I intended to go on doing, for as long as I was capable of it. I stood at his bench for a while longer. The summer evening light came through the north windows in the specific golden quality of a Gothenburg evening in July, warmer and more amber than the Stockholm light I was used to. Outside, my mother was in the garden with a glass of wine. I picked up the plane that was on the bench. It was the plane he had used for 30 years, kept sharp and properly set, ready to cut. I set it back down. I went inside. The grain of the wood tells you what it wants to do. You work with the grain. Everything else, in the end, is just paperwork. I want to tell you about a specific commission that came in the year after the settlement, because the commission was the most complete expression of what the company had become and of what the whole arc of the preceding year had been in service of. The commission was from a woman named Ingrid Höglund, who was 63 years old and who had spent her career as a curator at the National Museum, the Swedish National Museum of Art. Craft and design on Blasieholmen in central Stockholm. She had retired the previous spring and was furnishing a house she had purchased in Sörmland, about an hour south of Stockholm, that she planned to use as a permanent residence after a lifetime of city apartments. She came to the workshop on a recommendation from the Konstfack professor who had supervised my final year. She spent 2 hours in the workshop on a Tuesday morning, looking at the pieces that were in progress and the samples and the reference photographs, and asking questions that were, in the way of her professional formation, extremely precise. Not about the craft techniques, though she understood them, but about the thinking. What were the pieces trying to do? What was the relationship between the formal decisions and the material? What was the specific quality of rightness that I was after? And how did I know when I had arrived at it? I answered everything as completely as I could. And at the end of the 2 hours, she said, "I want you to make me a study, a room of furniture desk, chair, shelves, a small table for making tea, all of it in the same language, working together. I want the room to feel like it has always been there. I want you to take the time it needs. I'm not in a hurry. I want it to be the room I work in for the rest of my life. This was the most significant commission I had received. Not the largest in financial terms, though it was significant in those terms too, but the most significant in the terms that mattered most to me. A person who had spent 40 years in the presence of exceptional made things, asking me to make the things she would live and work with for the rest of her life. I told her I would need to visit the house before I began. She said, of course. We drove out to Sörmland on a Wednesday in April. She and I, in her car, and spent the morning in the house understanding the space, the light at different times of day, the proportions of the room, the view from the window that she most wanted to be looking at when she was working, the specific quality of the silence in the house that she described as the thing she had moved there for. I took notes. I took photographs. I sat in the room for 20 minutes without doing anything, just being in the room and letting the room tell me what it was. On the drive back to Stockholm, I began to understand the study. Not the specific forms, yet those came later. In the workshop, through the process of making and assessing. But the logic of it, what the room needed, what each piece needed to be in relation to the others and to the room. What the specific quality of rightness she had described looked like in material terms. The study took 8 months, not full-time. I had other commissions during those months, but the Höglund study was the primary project, the one that occupied the deepest layer of attention across the whole period. The desk came first, because the desk was the anchor of the room, and everything else would be defined in relation to it. Then the chair, which needed to work with the desk, but also to be right on its own. Then the shelves, which needed to hold books and objects without asserting themselves, which is a harder problem than it sounds, because shelves that do their job invisibly are actually more considered than shelves that announce their presence. Then the small table. I delivered the study in December, a year and a month after the first visit to the workshop. Ingrid Höglund was at the house when I arrived with the pieces. We installed everything over 2 days, placing each piece in its position, living with it for a few hours, adjusting, deciding. By the end of the second day, the room was what it needed to be. She sat at the desk on the second afternoon and wrote something in a notebook, I don't know what. I was at the other end of the room checking the shelf alignment, and I didn't look. She sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, and then she set the pen down and looked around the room and she said, without looking at me, "Yes, this is the room." I said nothing because nothing needed to be said. I drove back to Stockholm in the early December evening, through the Sörmland landscape that was gray and still in the winter light. And I thought about the route from the workshop in Mölndal to this from my father's concrete floor, and the north windows, and the plane on the bench, to the room in Sörmland that Ingrid Höglund would work in for the rest of her life. The route had not been straight. It had included the shareholder register, and the conversion clause, and the EGM, and the 4 months of proceedings, and the settlement, and the end of the relationship with Lena and Aldo. The things those contained. It had also included the craft and the standard, and the 37 years of making things, as well as I could make them. The route had arrived where it needed to arrive. The company was mine. The work was mine. The room in Sörmland was exactly what it needed to be. This is what the whole thing was, for not the legal victory, not the recovered equity, not the correct shareholder register. The ability to make the room in Sörmland for someone who would spend the rest of her life in it, and who would know, sitting at the desk that I made for her, that the desk was exactly right. That is the foundation. That is the grain. Everything else follows from it, or it doesn't follow at all. I want to tell you about the specific quality of Stockholm in December, because December is the month when the city is most completely itself, in the aspect that I find most true about it. And because the commission from Ingrid Höglund was completed in December, and the drive back through Sörmland to Stockholm was a December drive. And I want to tell you what that was like. Stockholm in December has almost no daylight. The sun rises around 9 in the morning and sets around 3 in the afternoon. And in between, the light is oblique and gray, and often obscured by the cloud cover that settles over the city for weeks at a time. This is, objectively, a difficult condition for a person who works in a craft that requires accurate visual assessment of color and surface and proportion. I deal with it through the artificial light in the workshop, which I have set up carefully over the years to approximate the quality of the north light that the natural winter day doesn't provide. But there is something about the December light, even the limited and oblique version, that is specific to this city and to this season. And that I have learned, across 20 years of living here, to value rather than simply endure. It has a quality of clarity that the summer light, for all its generosity, doesn't have. On the days when the cloud lifts and the low December sun comes off the water and hits the stone of the old buildings, the light is the most specific and most beautiful that Stockholm produces. It lasts for 3 or 4 hours, and then it is gone. And the going makes the arriving feel like something you were given rather than something you were owed. I was in the workshop when the December light came in on the morning after I returned from Sörmland, working on the finishing of a small commission, a set of serving utensils in birch. An unusual piece for me. Not furniture, but the kind of commission that a maker sometimes takes, because the material problem it presents is interesting in its own right. The light came through the north windows at 10 in the morning and stayed for 2 hours. And I worked through it in the specific quality of attention that good light enables a completeness of visual judgment that the artificial light approximates but doesn't reach. I was aware, while I was working, that this was what the previous year had been about, not in the abstract sense of fighting for something and winning, in the specific sense of being in a workshop in Stockholm on a December morning, with the right light and the right commission and the company intact and the shareholder register correct, making something as well as it could be made. This is the whole of what was at stake, the ability to continue doing this. In this workshop, on mornings like this one, I had it. I had fought for it, and I still had it. My father had given me the foundation, and Anna had given me the mechanism, and Jonas had given me the bridge, and the combination had been sufficient. The foundation had held. The work had continued. The company was mine. On the December morning with the good light, I finished the serving utensils and assessed them in the north light, and they were right. And I wrapped them and set them ready for collection, and I made tea, and I sat at the bench. The next commission was waiting a long commission, a year's work at least, a series of pieces for a house in Östermalm, whose owner had specific and sophisticated ideas about what she wanted, and had given me the time and the latitude to develop them fully. It was the kind of commission that would push me further than I had been pushed before, in directions I hadn't yet fully mapped. I opened the notebook where I had been making the first sketches. I began to work. The light lasted until noon. I worked through all of it. There is something I want to tell you about the months before I found the shareholder register. The months when the company was becoming what it was becoming. And when Henrik Bergstrom was watching it become that. Because those months are part of the story too. And because understanding them makes what came after more comprehensible. I was happy during those months. Not in a way I would have named as happiness at the time. I'm not a person who names states, who monitors his emotional condition with that kind of attention. But looking back, the period from the second year of the relationship with Lena through the summer before the October night was the period when the specific combination of things that make up a good life were most fully present simultaneously. The work was going well. The company was growing in the right direction. The relationship was close, and the dinners at Djursholm were genuinely pleasant. And Jonas's investment had created a sense of forward momentum that made the next year feel like it was going to be better than the current one. I was building something. I knew it was the right thing. The people around me, Lena, Jonas, the clients who were commissioning more complex and more interesting work confirmed that it was the right thing. The company was what it was supposed to be, doing what it was supposed to do, producing what it was supposed to produce. This is the specific texture of the period that the shareholder register disrupted. Not a perfect period. There were commissions that went over budget, and a cash flow difficulty in the spring, and the ordinary pressures of running a small creative practice, but a period of fundamental rightness, in which the daily work felt connected to the larger project in a way that the first year, the year of survival, had not always felt. Henrik Bergstrom had seen this. He had sat at the Djursholm dinner table, and he had seen a company at the beginning of its confident phase, after the difficult early years, and before the full realization of the value it was building toward. And he had made his assessment and designed his mechanism. I want to be clear about something. I do not think Henrik is a bad man in any simple sense. He is a man who made a specific kind of assessment and acted on it in a specific kind of way. And the assessment and the action were wrong in the moral and legal sense. But they were not the actions of a person who thought he was doing something wrong. He thought he was doing business. He thought he had found an opportunity and was taking it. In the specific way that he had been finding opportunities and taking them for 30 years in the commercial property market. What he had not fully accounted for was that the opportunity was a person's life work, and that the person whose life work it was would respond the way a person responds when their life work is at stake. I responded the way I respond to anything that requires a response, by understanding the problem completely and then working on it with everything I had, with patience and precision, and without cutting corners, until the work was done. The work was done. The company is mine. The workshop is below me as I write this, empty and ready for Monday morning when the next commission week begins. The north windows are dark. It is evening, but in the morning they will let in whatever light the season provides, and the light will be sufficient, and the work will continue. This is the whole of it. The work continues. That is all there is to say. And it is enough. And it is everything. I want to tell you about the workshop itself, because the workshop is the center of the story, in a way that the apartment and the legal proceedings in the relationship are not. And because describing it accurately is the closest I can come to conveying what was at stake. The workshop occupies the ground floor of the building on Södermalm. It is long and narrow, about 14 meters by 6, with the concrete floor that I poured in my first year. After 2 months of working on inadequate subfloor that produced a dust problem I could never fully resolve. The north windows run along the full length of the north wall, high up, providing the even and shadowless light that north windows provide and that a workshop requires for accurate assessment of surface and color. The south wall has the timber storage boards stacked on the wall-mounted rack that I built in year 2, organized by species and thickness and moisture content. The inventory of material for the commissions that exist and the commissions that don't exist yet, but that will exist when the right client comes with the right brief. The bench is in the center, a 12-centimeter slab of beech on a hardwood frame, with the vise that I brought from my father's workshop after he died, and that has been the primary working vise since. The surface of the bench is marked from years of use saw cuts, chisel impressions, the specific pattern of wear that a working bench acquires over time, and that a craftsperson learns to read as a record of the work. I don't refine the surface of the bench. The marks are the history. The tools are on the north wall, arranged in the specific order that my father used, and that I have maintained, because the order is the one that makes sense, the planes grouped by size and function. The chisels in the graduated set from narrow to wide. The marking tools and the layout tools in the specific sequence of how they are used in the making of a piece. The arrangement looks, to a non-woodworker, like a decorative display. It is actually a working system, a form of memory in space, where the location of each tool is a piece of information about when in the process you use it and what its relationship is to the tools around it. I spend more time in this room than any other place in my life, more time than the apartment upstairs, more time than any of the restaurants and cafes and meeting rooms that the professional life also requires. The workshop is the place where the most important thing I do happens, and it is the place where I am most fully the person I have been building myself into since I was 6 years old, watching my father at his bench in Mölndal, when Henrik Bergström's 38% stake was in the shareholder register. It did not change anything in this room. The bench was the same. The tools were the same. The boards on the wall rack were the same. The light through the north windows was the same. The work I was doing was the same work I had been doing before the conversion clause was exercised, and it was the same quality, and the clients who received it were as satisfied as they had ever been. This is the specific fact that the whole experience confirmed the company's value was not in the shareholder register. It was in this room. It was in the knowledge and the craft and the accumulated relationships and the specific quality of the work, none of which was transferable to Bergström Invest AB or capturable in any legal structure. The legal structure was the administrative expression of the company. The company itself was what happened in this room every day. Henrik understood this. Eventually, I think he understood it before the EGM, in the period when the position was weakening and Matilda Eck was advising him toward a settlement. He had acquired a 38% stake in a furniture company, and the furniture company had continued to operate exactly as it had before he acquired the stake. and the person who ran it had not panicked or made concessions or done any of the things that a person does when their principal asset is under threat. He had kept making furniture. He had kept delivering commissions on time. He had kept the clients and the pipeline and the reputation intact. The stake was worth what it was worth because of what happened in this room. And what happened in this room was not in his 38%. I think this is what the settlement's favorable terms reflected. Not the legal strength of the case alone. The case was strong, but contested. And the specific terms we achieved were better than the legal strength alone would have produced. The terms reflected a recognition that the mechanism had failed in a fundamental way. Henrik had acquired equity in something that was not acquirable in the way he had assumed it was. The company was mine because the work was mine. The work was mine because it was in me. That is not a romantic claim. It is a practical one. The craft and the knowledge and the relationships and the specific quality of judgment that produces the right piece, rather than a piece. These things are not in a document. They are in a person. And the person in whom they resided was me. The shareholder register confirmed this in March, when it was corrected, but the confirmation was always redundant. The work was always mine. It remains mine. The workshop is below me. The light will come through the north windows in the morning. The work will continue. In the years since the settlement, I have thought sometimes about what I would have done if the case had gone differently, if Anna's challenge had failed, if the court had confirmed the transfer, if Henrik Bergstrom's 38% had become a permanent feature of the company's structure. I think about this not because I believe the outcome would have been fatal, but because thinking about it clearly tells me something about what the company actually was and where its resilience lived. If the transfer had been confirmed, I would have had 3 options. I could have continued as managing director under a governance structure where Henrik's stake gave him significant influence. I could have bought him out at market value, which would have been expensive but not impossible over time. Or I could have wound down Lindqvist Wubel Design Abe and started again under a new name. The third option would have been the right one. Not because of pride. I'm not someone for whom the company name or the corporate structure carries the weight of identity. Because the specific company that Henrik would have held 38% of would have been fundamentally different from the company I had built. A company in which a significant stake was held by someone who had acquired it through misrepresentation, whose interests were financial extraction rather than the quality of the work, and whose presence would have created a permanent tension between the commercial logic of a return-seeking investor and the craft logic of a maker whose priority is quality. That tension would have destroyed the company over time. Not immediately. Henrik was sophisticated enough to understand that destroying the quality of the work would destroy the value of his stake. And he was patient enough to wait for the right exit. But the presence of his interests in the governance would have made every significant decision a negotiation between what the work required and what his return required. And those two things are not always aligned. I had built the company on the premise that they were aligned, that making the best possible work produced the best possible commercial outcome. This premise is true in the long run. It is not always true in any specific short-term transaction. An investor who needs a return in a defined horizon makes different decisions than a craftsperson who is building a reputation over decades. The settlement had preserved the premise. I was free to continue making the best possible work without having to negotiate the premise against a financial interest that didn't share it. This is the most important thing the settlement produced. Not the equity, not the financial terms, not the corrected register. The freedom to continue working on the terms that the work required. I have that freedom. I use it every day. The work is what it is because of it. That is the whole story. The grain tells you what it wants to do. You work with the grain.